turning an image into black and white seems like a simple, straightforward thing to do. However, there are a lot of factors that we need to take into consideration, otherwise some important contrasts and information might get destroyed. There are many ways for making a grayscale version. Some are more accurate, some are more convenient, and some are just useless. And even with the best digital method, there are outside factors like the calibration of your monitor or color blindness that should be taken into consideration. Alright, without further ado, let's start the actual tutorial. In this video I'll mostly use Photoshop since it's the most established image editing software. Later we'll also show some stuff in Clip Studio Paint and GIMP to point out some differences. The very first grayscale conversion method I want to talk about is one that I see a lot of people do, using the desaturate image adjustment. Or reducing the saturation to 0 and hue saturation, which produces the same result. This particular method is enormously inaccurate, and you should never do this. Let me show you why. Here's a gradient of all the hue colors. Now look what happens when I use desaturate. Well, everything just turned into the same gray. It does not take into consideration that blue, for example, looks quite dark, and yellow is very bright. This method just completely destroyed those contrasts. A grayscale conversion is supposed to preserve those contrasts as much as possible though, at least most of the time. To make it even clearer why it is so important, I prepared a simple yellow text on a blue background. This could be some kind of urgent warning, or some other very important information. And now when I use desaturate again, you probably know what's gonna happen. Yep, it all turned into the same gray. The warning text is completely unreadable now. This could have detrimental consequences. But there are several methods that are far better. One of the most straightforward methods would be to go to Image, Mode, and then select Grayscale. You will get a warning that any color information will be lost, so be aware of that. It also says to control the conversion, use image adjustments black and white, which is actually a bit misleading because that method works quite differently. We'll get to that later though. There we go, this time it didn't lose any of its readability. And this method is actually the best one to preserve the original contrasts because it is based on the perceptual lightness of the CIELAB color space. Let me explain what that means. Here we have a table of colors that all have a perceptual lightness of about 50% and a gray background with the same value. That is why it's quite hard to look at most of those colors, because they sort of blend into the background and we struggle to read the shapes. Sorry about torturing your eyes like that, but this table is very useful for demonstrating how well the grayscale conversions work. So let's switch to grayscale again. It asks if I want to merge the layers, but in this case it's fine to leave them unmerged. And there we go, all colors turned into the same gray. The exact same happens when I have a set of colors with 75% perceptual lightness, and with 25%. This proves that this grayscale conversion indeed uses CIELAB, which is specifically designed to group colors according to how bright humans actually see them. Well, those without any significant visual impairments, that is. CIELAB is therefore much better suited for this purpose than HSL, for example, the color space that is used for the hue saturation adjustment. Let me quickly create an adjustment layer of the type and reduce the saturation down to 0. You can see that the result is very different. Some colors are way darker, some are way brighter, it's a complete mess. Again, never use this method to create a grayscale version. Now there is another thing I should point out. The more saturated colors don't blend as much into the background as the lowly saturated colors. You could say that they sort of look brighter. However, when I brighten the background, the contrast actually increases, so the colors become even less similar to the background. This is because of the so-called Helmholtz-Kohlrausch effect, which basically says that the more vibrant colors are perceived brighter, even if they actually aren't. In other words, in addition to the brightness contrast, there is also a color contrast, and it is impossible for the perceptual lightness of CIELAB to compensate for that. Therefore, even if the grayscale conversion that is based on CIELAB is the most accurate, it is not perfect, because this color contrast gets lost too. To illustrate why this can become a problem, here's another example. Sorry again, looking at this is very headache inducing. However, for the most part you can read this red text on the grey background, even though they have about the same perceptual lightness. But when I convert to grayscale with a method that's based on CIELAB, this all turns into the same grey and the text is unreadable. That is why there is no such thing as a universally perfect grayscale conversion, and depending on the circumstances you might need to use a different tool or make some additional adjustments. So let's continue and take a look at the other methods. This table is still very useful to illustrate the differences between those various methods, so I'll continue using it. One very easy and convenient way would be to create a fill layer, use a grey color, and then set the blending mode of that fill layer to either hue, saturation or color. This will also turn everything into grey. A lot of the colors got darkened, especially the highly saturated ones. So yeah, it's not the most accurate method, but it's not as extremely inaccurate as the hue, saturation, color adjustment. Also, since it's just a layer, you can easily turn it off and on, and clip it to specific layers and folders that you want to turn into grayscale. This is a whole lot more convenient than converting the entire project file and discarding all color information. Now you might be confused because one of the blending modes is called saturation. It's actually not the same saturation as of the HSL color space. These blending modes are their own thing. The hue is the same as in HSL, but saturation and luminosity are different. I could go on a long tangent explaining this whole color space stuff and needlessly making this video a whole lot longer. Instead, if you want to learn more about HSL, CIELAB and other color spaces, then you can check out my video that talks about them in great detail. So, there are a couple more ways to utilize these blending modes. You could for example use adjustment layers like hue saturation and set it to one of those blending layers. Now the mode of this layer has changed, and zero saturation means the blending mode saturation. I'm sorry if this is confusing. There are at least 3 significantly different meanings for the word saturation in Photoshop. The naming conventions are a mess, let me tell you. Anyways, so another way would be to use the layer style feature of Photoshop. I add the color overlay to this folder, choose a grey color once again, and set it to one of the 3 blending modes. There you go, the same result again. And you can easily turn it off and on if needed. Alright, there's another special adjustment layer called black and white. Name's pretty straightforward. The default is not exactly the most accurate, as you can see. However, this gives you more flexibility since you can change the lightness of all the primary and secondary RGB colors individually. Despite this extra adjustability though, it's still far from perfect. That is because this adjustment layer is actually also based on HSL, unlike hue saturation. If I set everything to 50, you see that the results are identical. No difference to the normal hue saturation adjustment layer. And when I change around the sliders, you'll see that no matter how hard I try, I cannot make all the colors blend into the background. I can at least get sorta close for the medium and low saturation colors, but the highly saturated colors will remain very imbalanced. Now again, it's not that important to adjust everything to the perceptual lightness. Important is that your end result looks good and no vital information is lost. The black and white adjustment option definitely gives you more control to achieve those goals. However, that is not the only method for fine adjusting the results. For example, I could use the fill layer method again, and then underneath that layer I have an adjustment layer, like curves for example, that lets me adjust the colors before they get turned into grey. That's because the adjustment and blending layers get applied one after another, with the bottom one at first. And well, those are all the methods I know of to convert an image into grayscale in Photoshop. Let me shortly jump over to Clip Studio Paint to point out some differences, because not every graphics program works the same way. Here for example, there is simply no way to convert the entire project into grayscale. Instead, every individual layer has a color mode, which you can change under Convert Layer. Here you can switch to a grayscale mode. But once again, be careful because all color information will be lost. And as you can see, this conversion is not based on CIELAB's perceptual lightness. This grayscale layer mode is instead mostly based on the blending mode luminosity, which is strangely called brightness here in Clip Studio Paint. Instead, luminosity refers to the L in HSL here. Again, naming conventions in the world of color spaces are a mess. Okay, I'll stop ranting, sorry. So yeah, Clip Studio Paint, as far as I know, actually does not have a grayscale conversion that is based on the perceptual lightness. I also tested out GIMP and found out that it's actually better than Photoshop for grayscale conversion. So GIMP can also convert the entire project to grayscale, and it is CIELAB based too. But more importantly, the desaturate color adjustment is actually really useful here. It lets you choose among several modes, of which one of them is the luminance, in other words, the perceptual lightness. You can see that all the colors perfectly blend into the background again. And additionally, this change is reversible at any time, because GIMP works with effect layers. And therefore, when you click on the effect symbol on the layer, you can find and turn off the desaturate effect whenever you want. If you want to convert everything into grayscale and not just specific layers and folders, then there is another neat way. Firstly, create a layer, fill it with any sort of gray, you can choose the middle gray option for that purpose, and then change the blending mode. Here you can find far more options than in Photoshop by default. And some of them are based on LCH, which is a color space that utilizes the same perceptual lightness as CIELAB does. Therefore, select either LCH color or chroma, click OK, and now you can see that once again all the colors successfully turned into the same gray. I haven't fully explored all the possibilities in GIMP, but these features definitely stood out to me. Alright, I now have explained all the conversion methods that I know of. However, there are a few more things that you need to consider. One is quite important: your screen. Your PC monitor, tablet screen, or whatever you're using has a specific color calibration, which also applies to the grays. Different screens can show different grayscale contrasts, especially among the darker shades of gray. It could, for example, happen that you start to see black even though you are only at a very dark gray. This would make your images too dark and you would lose information in the darker color ranges. And there are tools for calibrating your monitors more professionally, but those are usually not cheap, and there is a limit to how accurate those screens can be, especially cheaper ones. This contrast is also influenced by the brightness setting of your screen. If it's very dark, then the contrast is lower. Not everyone wants to be blinded by glaringly bright light all the time though. And something else that can influence the colors and contrast is the light of your surroundings. What we see on our displays is just light after all. Our eyes don't only adjust to the brightness of the display, but also the environment. If you are, for example, outside during a sunny day, not standing in any shades, then it could become difficult to read what's on your phone if it isn't set to maximum brightness. That's not just because of our eyes adjusting to the overall brightness, but also because some amount of light gets reflected off the screen surface. Granted, the percentage is quite small, but it can still be enough to overpower the light that gets emitted by your device itself. This can be especially an issue if it's not perfect white light, but some kind of colored light. That would shift the colors you see on your screen. So yeah, there are technological limitations that influence how we see colors and grays. Also something to keep in mind. Lastly, I'd like to talk about color blindness. Now you might think that if you turn an image into grayscale, then there should be no issues for colorblind people anymore. Well, it's not that simple. To demonstrate this, I'm going back to Photoshop to our color table again. Now something I can do is go to View, Proof Setup, and here I can find two different colorblind modes. Protanopia, which is the lack of functioning red cones in the eyes, and deuteranopia, the lack of functioning green cones. Unfortunately, tritanopia, which means no blue cones, is missing. No idea why. Even though it's much rarer, it still should be included, in my opinion. But anyways, so if I select protanopia for example, then all the colors are shown in that mode. By clicking on Proof Colors, or just pressing Ctrl Y, I can easily turn this mode off and on. It has to be said though that it's not perfect. I don't have color blindness myself, but from what I read, including the feedback of a friend of mine with protanopia, it's good enough. And so what we can see here is that some of the contrasts have changed now. If I use my on-screen color picker again, we can see that some of the colors diverted significantly away from 50%. This colorblind mode is just sort of a surface filter and isn't actually applied to the colors in the project. If I convert to grayscale again, everything still turns into the same gray because it bases the conversion on the original colors. And therefore I prepared an extra set where I adjusted the colors in the table manually to be the same as in the colorblind mode. And if I convert to grayscale now, the differences in contrast become even clearer. To demonstrate what consequences this could have, I prepared more text examples. Now all of you who don't have color blindness, especially not protanopia, would agree that the text at the top is much easier to read than the bottom one. The difference in perceptual lightness for these two colors is way larger than the other two. However, when I turn the protanopia mode on again, now it's the opposite. The top one is now barely readable and the bottom color pair has more contrast now. This also means of course that the grayscale versions of the two would look very different. But as I explained before, this cannot be done directly in Photoshop since it's only considering the original colors. So you'd have to use some external tool to convert the colors, put the result back into Photoshop, and then convert to grayscale. It would be nice if you could do all of this directly in Photoshop. The color conversion algorithm is already in there after all. Well, that's at least what I personally understood about the issue that could come with color blindness. Things are not so straightforward though. The colors and contrasts that colorblind people see vary quite strongly, especially if you also consider partial color blindness. So, for example, not protanopia, but protanomaly. This is the first time that I looked into this topic in such detail, and there are a lot of things about color blindness that I still don't know. Therefore, if you have more experiences, especially if you're a colorblind person yourself, it would be awesome of you if you shared your knowledge in the comments. As you saw, turning colors into grays is a bit more complicated than a lot of people think. Depending on the method you choose, your contrast could drastically change. I hope that this video gave you a good overview though, and that you have a better idea of how to get the grayscale version that you are aiming for. If you have any constructive feedback, then please let me know down below, and perhaps consider joining my Patreon if you want to support me creating more videos in the future. Alright then, thank you a lot for watching, and see you next time.